think we are in for a very special evening. In some ways, I feel like our series so far has been building up to the conversation we're about to have, talking about certain experiences that seem to defy scientific explanation, what are typically called near-death and out-of-body experiences. Now, as you know, this is an extremely controversial subject, which often pits purely materialist explanations against explicitly religious ones. This evening, we will hear a variety of perspectives on our panel, and we're going to have some fun. Now, the reason I find this topic so fascinating is that near-death experiences push us to the edge of what we know about the nature of consciousness, which I happen to think is the most exciting frontier in science today. And as Richard mentioned, I'm a little bit biased here. I produced a big radio series on the subject last year. Not only are stories of near-death experiences remarkable in themselves, they raise profound questions about what is often called the mind-body problem and whether there is any dimension of consciousness that exists beyond the brain. And lucky for us, we have a terrific panel to sort out these questions. So let me introduce our speakers. Peter Fennick, at the far end of the panel there, is a neuropsychiatrist affiliated with Maudsley Hospital, the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, and the Broadmoor Special Hospital for Violent Offenders. He has a long-standing interest in questions about consciousness and is a leading clinical expert on near-death experiences. His books include The Art of Dying and The Truth in the Light, an investigation of over 300 near-death experiences. Mary Neal, in the middle, is an orthopedic spine surgeon based in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. She attended the UCLA Medical School and completed her orthopedic surgery training at the University of Southern California. She's the author of the memoir To Heaven and Back, which tells the remarkable story of her life-changing experience while being pinned underwater in a kayaking accident in Chile. Her story was recently featured on Anderson Cooper's show 360 on CNN. Kevin Nelson is a professor of neurology at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, where he practices clinical neurology and neurophysiology. He serves on the board of directors of the American Association of Neuromuscular and Electrodiagnostic Medicine. He has a particular interest in what's happening in the brain during intense spiritual experiences. He's the author of The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, a Neurologist's Search for the God Experience. And finally, Sam Parnia has a doctorate in cell biology and is also an MD. He's an assistant professor of medicine at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where he is director of resuscitation research. He also directs the Awareness During Resuscitation Study, and he's the author of 2 popular science books, What Happens When We Die and Erasing Death, the science that is rewriting the boundaries between life and death. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you.
Now, part of the difficulty of talking about this whole subject of near-death experiences is its definitions. What do we mean? So, Peter, I'm going to start with you. The phrase near-death experience seems to cover a wide range of experiences. Is there common agreement about what these are and what triggers them?
There is a common agreement, but it's not very common. Near-death experiences are thought to be experiences which occur when people are close to death. And they have a number of features. And these features can be measured by a scale. And the scale was devised by Bruce Grayson, and it's called the Grayson Questionnaire. So you give people the questionnaire, and if they tick certain boxes, then the experience they had was a near-death experience. But you see, it doesn't only occur near death. If it did, that would be very easy. It occurs also in psychological states where you're not near death at all. You may be very frightened. Or it may be that you're having a crisis of some sort, and you may get similar phenomena. And then it can also occur to some people quite spontaneously. So are these all near-death experiences or not? So when I looked at near-death experiences, I thought there was very little point in looking at near-death experiences which would occur if I didn't know what the brain was doing. So I chose specifically those when I thought there was no brain function. In other words, those during cardiac arrest. I know what the brain is doing. I can ask intelligent questions about near-death experiences, so that's what I've done. So there's no absolute agreement, but if you get a score on the Grayson scale and you have an experience where you go down a tunnel meet a being of light, go into an English country garden. You can tell I'm English. And you then may meet dead relatives. You may then also have a life review, come to a border, and then be sent back. Those are all things or points on the Grayson scale. And if you get over 7 of these, then you're said to have a near-death experience.
Kevin, I want to turn to you. You have also been studying this. You wrote a whole book about near-death experiences. Do you basically agree with that definition?
Yeah, I agree with much of what Peter has said, and I want to amplify a couple of points. First off, these are near-death experiences. These are not a return from death experiences. And so in the medical literature, there's been a lot of sloppiness with the term clinical death. Well, clinical death to a neurologist means your brain's dead, and that's not what's happening here. In fact, during these experiences, the brain is very much alive and very much active. So I think we, from a neurologist standpoint, that has to be very clear. The other thing that Peter pointed out that I think is really worth going into some detail is that many of the triggers for these experiences are in fact simple fainting. The brain, because of its metabolism, requires constant blood flow. Now, if that blood flow goes below a threshold for 10 seconds, that threshold is 23 milliliters per 100 grams of brain per minute, for those of you who are, like numbers, consciousness will be lost in 10 minutes. That doesn't mean that the brain's not functioning, and it doesn't mean the brain is dead. It simply means that the functioning is impaired. There's a second threshold of blood flow if it's diminished to about 17 milliliters per 100 grams of brain per minute, where irreversible brain damage is going to start occurring. And that generally begins in depends on the extent that the blood flow is diminished, can start in 2 to 3 minutes, but it can also take several hours.
So you're saying there's no such thing as coming back from clinical death?
There is no coming back from clinical death, and let me make this very clear. When a brain dies, the cells, the nerves, which comprise that brain burst like a water balloon because we have an inrushing of sodium or calcium, and that causes the cells to lyse. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once that neuron bursts, it's gone. Now, when a critical number of these neurons die within the brain, then the whole organ may reach a point where it's irretrievably dead.
Okay. Sam, I want to turn to you. Do you agree with that definition of clinical death?
Well, I think, if I may, I'll take a step back, actually, to sort of perhaps give my perspective on what Peter started out with and what was just being said. You have to remember where we've come from to be able to appreciate this question a bit better, which is that if you think about it, for centuries, if not millennia, people have tried to reverse death. Who wants to die? Nobody wants to die. People have tried that, and, well, there are exceptions these days. Who used to want to die, they didn't, right? And unfortunately, human beings were not successful at reversing death. And essentially, the way that death has been defined and still continues to be defined in most cases is when the heart stops beating. Because when the heart stops beating, a person stops breathing immediately, and the brain also stops functioning because there's no blood getting into the brain. And that's why people develop fixed and dilated pupils. So you've seen that in the films. Those are the 3 criteria by which doctors today define death. That's when they write your death certificate. So this perception was created that there is a moment of death that could not be reversed because there was no science to do so. Now, 2 important things occurred in the 1960s which changed this enormously. And the first thing was that there was the advent of modern intensive care medicine, where essentially people who were critically ill, who were going to die, were now able to be preserved using life support machines. So a bit like an airplane that's about to crash, but now you have a system to pull it up and prevent the crash from happening and people coming back out of it. The second thing that was discovered at the same time, quite by chance, was modern cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR, which essentially allowed physicians to restart the heart in people after they had gone beyond that traditional threshold of death. So what then occurred over the ensuing couple of decades was that actually more and more, thousands, millions of people were now being brought back to life, either because they'd been very close to death or they had temporarily gone beyond the traditional threshold of death. And these people had incredible experiences. They were universal, as Peter pointed out. They described seeing beings of light. They described going through a tunnel, a beautiful place, having a review of their lives, and sometimes watching events that were going on in hospitals. Now, we as scientists, when this was first described, like anything that's described for the first time, were perplexed, because essentially it was a new phenomena. And although the people who had the experience believed that they were real, the scientific reaction really reflected people's own personal views, like much of what our perceptions about life and death is. If you were to go out there today and ask people what you'll find their perception about what happens after death reflects their cultural beliefs, their religious beliefs, their personal beliefs, or a combination of. That's why there are thousands of opinions out there.
But I want to jump in on one point, because it seems like there's a disagreement between what you're saying and what
Well, I was
Kevin
about to
was
touch
saying.
on that, but I think that's
Okay.
important just to get the framework of where we're coming from. So now, what Kevin was mentioning, which I think is very valid, is, and this is what's been discovered more in the 21st century, is that essentially after a person dies through the conventional ways, which is, and it's defined in two ways. One is what I just described, which is circulatory failure, when your heart stops. And I would say to you, as an intensive care physician, 95 to 99% of patients that we define, write a death certificate for them, this is the mode of death. Now, the other thing, though, that's happened is that when those people have died, what we now understand is that those brain cells don't immediately go through the process that Kevin just mentioned. They don't immediately disintegrate and disappear. There's a process that can take potentially hours. So now, understanding that, another dilemma that's come about, which is what Kevin was referring to through intensive care, is that you can have people who would have traditionally died by their heart stopping or breathing, but are now being maintained on life support machines in my intensive care unit, but have had massive brain injuries, such that the brain itself can independently die before the heart has stopped.
But just
So that's brain death, and that's what Kevin was referring to.
Okay, but it sounds like you're saying that people in a clinical sense have died, and in some cases through resuscitation come back, and Kevin, you're saying that's not possible. I mean, people have not died. You cannot come back from death.
The term clinical death causes all kinds of confusion. And it causes confusion because people think, well, I can return from clinical death. No, death is death. It's irreversible. I mean, once a cell dies, once an organ dies, it is dead. Now, as Sam points out, and rightfully so, if you have cardiac arrest, well, the brain's still working because it's going to work for probably about 10 seconds, even with no blood flow. But oftentimes, particularly in the ICUs and in the field, and when there's cardiac events, it's not so cut and dry. In fact, the heart starts up, it kind of slows down, or it may stop for a while, then start up again. It may beat ineffectively. So there's all kinds of very important factors that go into. It will appear that someone is dead. They may be comatose. They may have their eyes up, and they may be paralyzed, but they're not dead.
But if I may say, though...
And to call it clinical death, in a scientific term, I think it lends itself to this, particularly if people are not medically sophisticated, that there's a return from death. And these are not a return from death experiences. These are a near death. You've gone to the edge, but you haven't gone over the edge.
But I think the people we deal with, actually, Kevin, do go beyond the edge, and that's the point. I mean, this is how death is declared in this country. It's basically when your heart stops beating, you have no breathing, and your pupils are fixed and dilated. That is the criteria for determining death in people. Now, what we're all saying is sort of similar, is that the social perception of death, and that's important, is that death has to be a point by which you cannot come back ever again. And that may be that we need to redefine the way we even issue death certificates in the future. But right now, and if you think about the guy who on the street right now potentially is having a car accident as being declared dead by ambulance crews who arrive there, that's the way that they have died. They haven't yet developed that permanent brain death. But that's how it's being done all over this city, all over this country, all over the world. So when you watch movies or you look at literature, when people talk about death or the perception of death, that's the majority that we're talking about.
Right. Most of the time when I declare someone dead, I don't need to declare them brain dead. Their heart has stopped for a period of time to where you know the brain could not survive. But it's the brain surviving or not which is the critical factor here. We're talking about the brain. during these experiences. When you speak to experience, when you speak to human experience, you're speaking about the brain.
I would tell you, I would add one other thing, because part of this whole discussion is, and we could spend the whole night trying to talk about what is death, but the reality is there are many different definitions of death. I would go a step further and tell you that my own definition of death at this point is when the spirit leaves the body.
And that's
Having
a matter
nothing
of
to
faith.
do, well,
And not science. That is
I'm just
faith.
telling
And
you-
and I think that's perfectly acceptable. But you have to realize
it's a different definition of death. And
and
the
it's not
point
a
I'm
science
making
one,
is
though.
that we can discuss it all night, but we're never going to come up with a universal definition of death, because the fact is there are probably 5 acceptable and reasonable definitions of death, each person from their own perspective. How you write the death certificate, how you monitor it
That's
with
exactly what I'm
EEGs.
saying, Mary. Yes, you can define it however you like, but when you speak to human experience, you're speaking to the human brain. And so if you're speaking to death in the brain in context of death, you should speak to that organ's death, not to some surrogate phenomena of the heart stopping. That's a secondary phenomenon.
I think we're going to come back to this question of how we define death. Peter, how universal are these near-death experiences? I mean, is someone in China or Nigeria reporting basically the same kind of experiences as Americans do?
They're worldwide. Not only are they worldwide, they've also been throughout history. And certainly as far as Western history goes, right back to the Greeks, there are accounts of near-death experiences at that time. But the interesting question that's been raised is, are they the same? If you're Chinese, will you have the same experience as you would if you were American, if you were an Indian? Would it be the same? Well, no, there are cultural components. So in fact, they're different in different countries. And the sorts of differences are fairly simple. For example, I gave you what happens in European countries, in America. The fact that you go down a tunnel, that you meet a being of light, and then go into this nice English garden and have a life review. In fact, if you were in China, you'd probably do the same thing. But if you were in India, then you wouldn't. There probably wouldn't be any tunnel. You certainly wouldn't go out of your body before you go down the tunnel to meet the being of light. And in primitive societies, hunter-gatherers, they're much, much simpler than that. Just to give you the flavor for it, there's one well-known hunter-gatherer experience where a man died, and he got into a canoe, paddled for 3 days to an island. I expect it was like an English country garden. He stayed there, and then he paddled all the way back again. Now, that has the same sort of flavor as the near-death experience as we do today in Europe and America. So there are definite differences between
Why would
different
certain
people.
cultures see the tunnel, the white light, and other cultures not?
I don't think it's really known. We can talk about the Indian experience because that's been studied much more. In India, they believe in the god of death, and he has messengers called Yamduts. And he sends his Yamduts out to take the person and bring them back. So when you die, you're picked up by a Yamdut, and you go back to where the god is, and he looks in the book and sees exactly what you've done. Now, what Ian Stevenson, who studied them, said is quite often the guard who's reading the book says, "Hey, you brought me the wrong person." Take him back immediately. I didn't want that Patel, I wanted one of the other Patels. And Ian Stevenson called this official bungling. So there are very specific cultural phenomena which do occur.
Well, I want to turn to Mary now because you have had a remarkable story. You've written a whole book about it, nearly dying in a kayaking accident in Chile back in 1999. And I know you wrote a whole book about it, but can you briefly tell us the story of what happened?
I'll tell it very briefly and try to address some of the more detailed aspects that will address some of the more scientific questions that I perhaps didn't focus on in the book. And my experience began when my husband and I went to Chile to kayak. And we are avid kayakers, so this was not on a lark. And we decided to go on a river that's well known for waterfalls. It's something that was certainly within our skill set. We were kayaking down this section of river with friends of ours who are professionals that do this for a living. And when I came to the first big drop, the circumstances were such that I had to go over the main part of the waterfall instead of a smaller chute. And so I started over the drop, which was about 15 feet in that range. And when I saw the bottom, I certainly saw tremendous hydraulics, no clean outflow. And I have to preface this first by saying that I did grow up as a child of the 1950s, was taken to Sunday school, never really expected to incorporate that into what I was or into my life. And then I went off to college and medical school and residency and the whole deal. And I absolutely would say that before this experience, I would have responded yes if someone said, "Do you believe in God?" But I also absolutely subscribed and joined what I really feel is its own religion, which is really the religion of the intellect. You know, if I'm smart enough, if I spend enough money, and if I spend enough time looking at things, I will be able to answer all the questions that we're talking about. And so I, by no one stretch of the imagination, would have been called a particularly religious person or a zealot, and really had not given much thought to the death experience.
No, to return to the story of the
okay,
accident. So you went over the waterfall.
So I went over the waterfall, and the front of the boat, instead of hitting the bottom and being flipped out and tumbled around and spit out downstream, the front of the boat became pinned or stuck in the rocks, and I was immediately submerged under 8 or 10 feet of water. And so there were no air pockets. I was under solid water, so that I wasn't even visible from the surface. And I am a spine surgeon. I'm very calm and didn't panic, didn't do those things. It wasn't the first time I was under the water. Tried to free the boat, tried to free me from the boat. Became clear that nothing was working, and I'm a very pragmatic person. I knew that I was about to drown, and I asked that God's will be done. And the moment I asked that, I was immediately overcome with a very, very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured that everything was fine. My husband would be fine, my 4 young children would be fine, regardless of whether I lived or died. And we then went through a bit of a life review, and we looked at events not in isolation or judgment, but really looked at the beauty that came out of every event. And I was well aware of my circumstances. I could feel the water slowly sucking my body over the front deck of the boat. And I could feel my knees bending back on themselves and bones breaking and ligaments tearing. And at this point, I've been asked many times, well, did you feel yourself become unconscious? And I would say that I had been conscious and then more conscious. And I was still me. I was still my same somewhat cynical, analytical self. And my thought balloon off to the side was experiencing this and thinking, this is strange. And I thought about, okay, I know how long I've been underwater.
How long were you underwater?
Well, from the time that the people I was boating with identified where underwater I probably was to the time they initiated CPR was 15 minutes on the clock. And they would absolutely say that leading up to that point was another 15 minutes. So they are very clear that they believe I was underwater without oxygen for 30 minutes. I tend to focus on the 15 minutes because that is the shortest, absolutely objective measure of time. But I felt my body coming out of the boat. I felt my spirit peeling away from my body, and I could feel then my spirit rise up and out of the river. And I was immediately greeted by a group of somethings, people, spirits, beings. They were people that I absolutely knew on a very core level, had known me and loved me as long as I had existed. I knew them, I loved them, and we were all overjoyed. And I was very surprised with this whole process. I didn't have any preconceptions. And there was a shift in time, dimension, not quite sure what the words were, so that they could take me down this incredibly beautiful pathway toward this great dome structure of sorts that I knew was essentially the point of no return. I knew it was heaven, whatever word you want to put on it, and I could hardly wait. At the same time, I could look back at the scene at the river, and what had happened is my body came out of the boat, went downstream underwater, and actually bumped into one of the guys downstream. They pulled me out, started CPR, and I could see them do CPR. One guy was never able to divorce himself from the fact that it was me, his friend, kept calling to me to come back and take a breath. And I eventually would say, okay, and I'd interrupt our progress. I'd go back down this path, lie down, take a breath, and then rejoin these people, these spirits. I eventually did make it to this threshold, although he kept calling me back again and again and again. It was really very irritating. I did.
So you didn't want to come back?
Well, I hate to say it because my daughter is here, but one of the remarkable things, and really one of the things that was a great surprise to me, was an absolute sense of being home and an absolute sense of looking at my body, recognizing that that was my body, and that represented my life here. It represented my children. It represented my husband, and I had a great life. I had a husband that loved me. I loved my children more than I could ever imagine loving something on earth. I was not trying to escape something. I had everything to come back for, yet I had absolutely no intention of coming back, no desire whatsoever, part of which is I had been reassured. It wasn't just, you know, that's actually why I didn't tell my story for many years. I never wanted my children to know that I hadn't wanted to come back. I didn't want them to feel that they hadn't been enough of a reason.
I'm sure we'll come back to some of the details of your story, but just to back up for a moment, you said that you were brought up as a Christian. Maybe you didn't have that strong a faith before, that certainly you have since. Do you think your background as a Christian, as a person of faith, shaped the nature of this experience?
I do to a degree. I absolutely believe that there is one God, and that is the God of all of us, and I believe that God speaks to us in the way we will understand. And I believe that we are greeted by God's most gentle messengers, and that is different for each of us.
So, I mean,
so for me, for example, when I think about my experience, what speaks to me and makes me feel wonderful is color and flowers and aromas. And that's what I experienced. If I had heard Bach or Mozart, I would have thought I was in the wrong place. I mean, that doesn't speak to me. But it's the same here on earth. The mountains speak to me, the desert speaks to other people. And so I do think that culturally, our initial experience is influenced by what we are. But I also think that that makes sense. Because if someone in the boat came to collect me, that would create fear because it would be unknown. But instead, it was a situation that made me feel wonderful. And I too felt this absolutely pure, all-encompassing, overwhelming love.
Well, we have a panel full of scientists here. So we've just heard this remarkable story. What do the rest of you think of it? What do you make of this?
There are one or two points which I'd like to raise. The first one is the question of the life review. They're mainly found in Western experiences, so we'll probably all have life reviews if we have a near-death experience. Well, 12% of us will anyway. So that's one point. And the other point is that if you, certainly in our series and in most series, if you look at the religious affiliation of the people, it has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not they have an experience or not.
Will an atheist have an experience like this?
Atheists will have exactly the same experience.
Really?
So, yeah, you don't...
You including beings of light, angelic type creatures?
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. And
Peter, may I interrupt you just for a minute, though? Because I have a feeling that as people are hearing what you've been saying, the impression is that everyone has these experiences and they're all similar. But I want to make clear that everyone doesn't have an experience. And I think that's important because one of the explanations that people would like to say is that, gee, this is the result of a dying brain and it's entirely a physiologic experience. If you break your leg, I can tell you the physiology. And everyone is going to have a very similar experience, 100%. But the fact is 100% of people who are near death don't have an experience. And if it were purely a physiological experience, everyone would have it and they would all be very similar.
Well, I want to turn to Kevin now because you have written a book that basically tries to explain these experiences through physiological means.
Yeah, I think using a broken leg is not a great parallel here when you're talking about the brain. That's the orthopedist in you, and I'm a neurologist. There are certainly shared elements because we have shared physiology. We essentially all walk around with the same brain, that's what we share in common with our species. But there are definitely cultural differences, as Peter pointed out, and there's age-related differences too. Children who have near-death experiences are more likely to see, wizards and castles and Santa Claus, and maybe Jesus, depends on their background, than they are to see Elvis, for example. I mean, in fact, Raymond Moody, who wrote a book, who coined the term near-death experience, wrote an entire book on people seeing Elvis Presley, in their near-death experience. Now, actually, one of the questions I want to ask Peter was, do the people in the wilds of Papua New Guinea ever see Elvis? And my guess is not. My guess is that...
Your guess is quite right.
Yeah, we are bringing what we have as our life experience to this very dramatic event. And one thing I want to point out with Mary, and I mean, does it really matter what the brain is doing? I mean, the real value for Mary is how it transformed her and deepened her faith. That is really, in many ways, the most important thing that we should remember about this. I mean, I had a great meal last night, but do I care what my pancreas was doing at that time? No, I enjoyed my meal. Knowing what the physiologic basis of the experience is doesn't necessarily take away its value. In fact, it doesn't. In many ways, I think it enhances its value. As a famous physicist once said, it doesn't hurt to know the mystery, to know a little bit about the mystery.
I want to come back to this question of how much our prior beliefs shape the experience. Now, you said that atheists have these experiences.
Indeed, they do.
Why? I mean, presumably they don't believe in angelic beings.
No, they don't believe in angelic beings. We have two atheists in our series. The first one, and this, if you were listening to Mary, she was very careful about what she was saying. She was talking about the interpretation of the experience as she saw it. Well, if you were an atheist, you'd interpret the experience as you see it. And our first atheist refused any sort of being in the experience. What they did was they dissolved into pure energy, and they floated through a blue environment with pure energy. They came to the light, and they had the same experience of the overwhelming feelings of love, and then the experience ended. So it was not populated in quite the same way as Mary's experience was. The other one was very similar, but this time there were more people who they met, and they met dead relatives, which is very common in near-death experiences. So the fact that you don't believe anything is going to happen doesn't stop it happening.
I want to talk about another experience that often goes along with these near-death experiences, what are often called out-of-body experiences. Now, Mary, it sounds like you had one. I mean, basically where you're having this trauma, you have this sense of your spirit separating and often coming back and watching what's going on. And we've heard these stories of people who they say after they are revived that they could overhear the conversation in the operating room and report details. Sam, what do you make of those stories?
I think, we've touched on so many things, and one of the things we haven't done is talk about the fact that, and this comes to your question about out-of-body experiences as well, is that actually these so-called near-death experiences are actually not very well defined. And when people talk about them, like when Peter and Kevin are talking about these things, I, as a scientist, as an intensive care physician who deals with life and death on a daily basis, have no idea how critically ill these people they're talking about really were they really even anywhere near death? So one of the difficulties we have, and I think to simplify this, is that essentially the experience that we're talking about, this so-called near-death experience, I would rather call it really a deep mystical religious experience that people have when they've been very sick, when they've been very critically ill, or when they've gone beyond that traditional threshold of death. Now, when you study these populations, though, most of these patients that Peter's talking about and Kevin's talking about, we have no records of really how sick they were. And so often, the reason why there's a lot of debate between scientists is that people are lumping a lot of different experiences under the same umbrella term. For instance, a person in my intensive care unit who's critically ill from meningitis or from massive bleeding, hemorrhage, or from massive stroke, and who are about to die, have very different physiological processes. And therefore, mixing everything creates confusion. So now when you go to out-of-body experiences, we have the same issue, that certain people, such as Mary, who had a cardiac arrest, who traditionally went beyond the threshold of what people describe as death, and could see things going on. So she had what I call visual awareness. She could see what was happening, and she could perhaps hear conversations. They've been called out-of-body experiences. But then if you look around, people are lumping other things, like creating optical illusions in a laboratory by putting a camera behind your head and putting goggles on your eyes so that you cannot see anything in front of you, and the only vision that you can have is what the camera is showing to you, and leaving you like that for many hours. So after a period of time, your brain starts to think the reality of what you can see is what the camera is showing, which is basically the back of your head. And then coming along and attacking you with a hammer, or attacking the camera with a hammer, and you startling, getting scared, thinking you're about to be attacked, and labeling that an out-of-body experience. So that is not the traditional definition of what people describe. But out-of-body experiences certainly have been described in cardiac arrest settings, and people seem to be able to accurately recall what was being said, what was being done, and if you talk to their physicians, they will describe events that were occurring when patients were in asystole, or what we call flatline. Their heart had no electrical activity. There was nothing going on. I've seen cases, which one case particular that I was astonished by, where a colleague of mine told me of a patient who was not getting any kind of resuscitation, no chest compressions. The patient had been certified dead, left in the room, and they had left the person. And then they noticed 20 minutes later that actually the patient looks a bit different. The heart had been restarted, and the patient recalled everything, all conversations. So they do occur.
Isn't the critical
they're
question
sometimes
whether the brain has flatlined or not? I mean, whether the brain still has
One
activity?
of the things that Kevin mentioned also, which I think and I agree with, is that again, you're taking a hodgepodge of different experiences and we're mixing it all together. So of course, in certain cases, I absolutely agree. There are people whose brain hadn't flatlined, they hadn't even necessarily technically gone beyond the threshold of their heart stopping. But there are certainly cases where people have flatlined both from a heart perspective and from a brain perspective. And paradoxically, which we cannot explain, they are able to tell us exactly what was going on in the same way that anyone in this room would do, except the only difference is, for everyone else here, their cortex, this part of the brain that we need to relay consciousness, is working perfectly well. In these people, at best, their brain is fully dysfunctional, or as I said, completely flatlined.
Kevin, how do you explain out-of-body experiences?
There's actually very little to no controversy in the neurologic circles about out-of-body experiences. One of the remarkable things is that they're actually very common. 1 in 20 people are going to have an out-of-body experience in their lifetime. So if you look around you, there's quite a few people in this room. In fact, oftentimes when I speak, people will come up to me afterwards and say, geez, I had one of those, and I really told anybody about it. So feel free to do that if you choose. But why are they so common? Well, first off, they happen commonly during syncope. That is simple fainting, harmless fainting. About 15% of people who faint will have an out-of-body experience during that faint. And it can be, I have one subject who was a jet fighter pilot, and he was making a sharp turn, and he began to get syncopal, and boom, he was suddenly flying his jet from above the cockpit. He actually became a neurologist after that. But most of, or many of the out-of-body experiences actually happen when we blend waking and REM consciousness. There are three states of consciousness that we have. Brain's only got three choices. It can be awake, like many of you seem to be, and there's two conscious states of sleep. There's the non-REM sleep, and there's the REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep. And the hallmarks of that are profound visual activation, activation of the limbic system, and our emotional. Out-of-body experiences is actually part of the REM system. Bizarre dreams and the narrative quality of that. And during the REM state, we turn off an area called the temporal parietal region. Now, this is an area about here, which is important in synthesizing our experiences. It takes information from our inner ear, where we are in the gravitational field, it takes our vision, and it takes where our body sense seems to be, like where your right foot is right now. You didn't know that before I mentioned it, but now you're thinking about it. Well, that all comes in this one area. And if you disturb this area or turn it off, then, like we do in REM sleep, then you can have an out-of-body experience.
But why would you have this sensation of you're hovering above your body looking back down on it?
Well, they're all different. You can have very many different kinds of out-of-body experiences. You can be looking from behind. There are none that I'm aware of where you're down below on the ground. You can be off to the side, you can be behind, you can be in front, you can be on top. It's very common to be above, and that's a question I think needs some further thought. But the important thing is, for example, Ulf Blank, a neurologist in Switzerland, has taken an electrode in this area, and he'll apply the current. It's about 1/100th of a 60-watt light bulb. When he flips the switch on, boom, they're out of body. They can be above, they can be hovering behind. Turn the switch off, they're back in. So you're going up and down, kind of like the elevator out there, up and down out of your body. So there are very, and we've known this for a long time, and we've known this since the 40s when Wilder Penfield stimulated the temporal area and produced out-of-body experiences during neurosurgery. So we know that these can be done under very non-spiritual and threatening context. In fact, when we looked at our 55 people who've had a near-death experience and looked at their out-of-body experience, they were as likely to have an out-of-body experience during REM intrusion, that is when REM and waking consciousness were blending, as they were to have it during the near-death experience itself.
Okay, Peter, do you accept this explanation of out-of-body experiences?
Not much. And there's certain things I don't like about it, and there's certain things which I'll go along with. First of all, they are very common, as you say. There's no doubt about that. And also, ordinary people will have out-of-body experiences. Those, to me, aren't terribly interesting. What are interesting to me are the out-of-body experiences that you have during a cardiac arrest. Because remember I said that you have to know what the brain state was. And in cardiac arrests, on the whole, we do know what the brain state is, particularly if they are in people who are in a medical facility of some sort. Now, there are a lot of accounts of these. And one would normally think, okay, the person comes out of their body and then goes down the tunnel or something. It's not quite like that. They come out of their body and they perceive what is going on around them. Now, this is very important if your brain is not functioning, or certainly as far as one can get to it from the medical data, it's not functioning. But that's the first thing which is interesting. The second thing is they can get veridical or true information of the environment around them. Now, if that is true, then it suggests that mind and brain can separate. So that's the first point. And so you have to look at these ones very carefully, because there is nothing in our current science which suggests that mind and brain can separate, because our science says that mind is created by the brain. So you need to look at these experiences. So the first thing is, can they get true information? The next thing about the experiences is that they don't only get information from where they are in the OR room, they get it also by going through walls and hearing conversations from other people. And if you look at the accounts, then you will see that the people whose conversations they heard when they were unconscious, apparently, were in different rooms and there was no way that they could hear it. Now that's the data. Now you have to interpret it. Well, there have been 1 or 2 attempts to do this. One of the things that people, when they come out of their body, say is that if there is an object here, you can see its top and its sides. That's all right, but you can see its bottom at the same time. Now, that's not okay. And if you are out of your body, you shouldn't be able to go through a wall, because none of us can. So that's not okay either. So what are these people really saying? And there are 1 or 2 people who are suggesting that maybe they're in a 5-dimensional reality. In other words, it's an extra dimension. That will allow you to see tops and bottoms of things and will allow you to go through walls. So it's just another way of thinking about these phenomena and just taking them for what they are and saying, okay, what actually do they mean? So although the standard view would be, well, I can explain this in many different ways, but if you actually just stick to the data and see what it shows, then it raises some really interesting questions.
I want to come back to Kevin. Okay, what about these stories of people apparently hearing something that's happening in another room? I mean, their body isn't even in that other room, and then they report apparently what this conversation was.
Not much, in a much less appealing accent, I might say. First off, let's look at the data, because we really need to look at the data. The data isn't set in stone. In fact, there's a lot of ways in which people are aware of what's going on around them, and yet they appear dead. For example, if you have a cardiac arrest, what happens to your eyes? They open. If you've seen someone as a cardiac arrest, watch. You're not watching.
I deal with them every week. They never open. They're always closed. That's the one thing I can assure you of.
That's because you're not looking at the right place.
Of course I look at them. That's all I do.
If you study these and do recordings of during cardiac arrest, which general anesthesiologists do, what happens is that the eyes themselves move up, and the eyelids are actually half open and half closed. And then during the course of things, actually the eyelids will come down. So the initial movement's up, and then it comes down, and they're looking around. So people are actually taking in a lot more visually and through their sound than you may think. Now, what's one of the first neurologic things that is damaged during lack of blood flow to the brain? It's memory structures. And that's actually one of the last things to recover as well. The memory system is very, very activated during these times of crisis to the brain. Now, how we, bring memory in, is a very complex problem. There's a mountain of scientific evidence that shows that our memory is very fallible, and it's very suggestible, and it's very malleable. What someone may have said, as you heard in another room, can be incorporated into memory as a direct experience.
Well, I want to jump in here because what we're sort of talking around the big question here. The big question is the mind simply a product of brain function, which is the standard scientific model right now? I mean, when I've asked neuroscientists, how do you define the mind? That many of them will say the mind is what the brain does. So I mean, that's the question that is challenged. I mean, that's the issue at stake here. It seems to me the larger philosophical and scientific question. And so the question is there any way to challenge that with sound scientific data? And I want to come back to the question of out-of-body experiences because, Sam, I know you have been the director of a study called the AWARE study, which is actually trying to check on this in some scientific way to see if there's a way to prove that the mind is more than just brain function. Do you want to tell us about your study?
Not right now. I just wanted to actually, before we can do that, I just need to touch back on, it's important for everyone to understand what we're talking about. I deal with cardiac arrests every week. I've resuscitated hundreds, if not more, of patients, and it's my bread and butter. It's what I do for a living. And the important thing, which Peter was alluding to, is to understand that actually, while there are many things that make people become very sick, and their physiology is very different, and that's why I think we're talking about different things, and that's the whole point of we're comparing apples and oranges. I don't think we're all talking about the same thing, using the same terms. But with cardiac arrest, it's understood very well because we have to understand the physiology in order to be able to bring people back and preserve their brain. So as Kevin mentioned, when you have, at the beginning, when blood flow to the brain gets beyond a certain threshold, then the brain does not function. Now, when someone's heart stops, immediately, when there is no pumping of the heart, there is no blood, zero blood getting into the brain. And immediately, a patient will develop fixed and dilated pupils. They lose all of their brainstem reflexes, which is why we can put a tube into their airway and they don't gag. And their brain stops functioning completely within seconds. Now, when we do resuscitation, with the best of efforts that we make, we can only get a little bit of blood, 5% of the blood that the person has ordinarily, into the brain. And that's why throughout the entire period of resuscitation, the brain remains flatlined. And the pupils remain fixed and dilated. The brainstem does not function. The only cases where that may be an exception is if we have transiently restarted the heart and we lose it again. But when the heart doesn't beat, that's the case. Now, interestingly, to go to your question of consciousness, what we have is that we have many thousands, if not millions of people now who are reporting these incredible experiences from all over the world, many of whom have described our doctors, our nurses, conversations of what was going on. But you cannot have a functioning cortex in this time. It's not possible. So we're left with a paradox. So this led us to put together a more definitive study, which we call awareness during resuscitation, to try to iron out some of these issues. And part of that was to try to study the quality of oxygen getting into the brain and hopefully improve outcomes for our patients so they don't end up brain damage. And part of it was also to try to study these recollections that people have. Now, our study has been analyzed, and we will be releasing the results soon. But I can just give a little snippet, if I may, just because everyone asked us. And what we have found, and this is not just my interpretation, these are experts. We have at least 20 experts from neurology to psychiatry to various fields in neuroscience to emergency medicine who have conferred the findings that essentially our data suggests that these so-called out-of-body experiences, at least when they occur in the cardiac arrest setting, which is why I call them visual awareness, cannot be defined as a hallucination. They cannot be defined as a hallucination. They are not consistent with what we call a hallucination. Furthermore, what we've also managed to demonstrate is that essentially when a person has died, technically the way they're defined dead, that what happens to our consciousness is that it disappears from the external view. So a bit like how you go for surgery and you're given a general anesthetic, and you may appear that your consciousness is not there, it hasn't disappeared off the face of the earth. It's just not present. And so essentially, death is not something to be afraid of. And the final point, which I think is important, and it touches on a lot of things that were said, is that actually when you talk to people after the experiences, they're expressing many different memories. Some of the people who are telling you that they had a near-death experience, they're telling you about memories that were occurring a week or two later in the intensive care unit. And so the problem I have with a lot of the studies that my colleagues were quoting here is that you're taking people who had an experience 10 years ago. Who knows really what was going on at that time? So it's very important that going forward, we study the experience people have in cardiac arrest.
I'm sorry, I'm fascinated by this, but I just want to address one aspect, because a couple of people have mentioned these recollections, these memories, and one of the things that I find sets a near-death experience apart from any other experience. And we've all listened to many. I've listened to probably 500 stories, and we would all say the exact same thing, which is that I remember my own experience as precisely and accurately today as when it happened. And it's the experience of remembering something in the present tense. It's not recalling a memory from 10 years ago or 50 years ago.
You're saying there's a different quality to this kind of memory.
It is entirely qualitatively different from any other experience, dream, hallucination, or big event in your life. It is a qualitatively different type of memory. So it's really not a recollection. And I think that's one of the things that is interesting from a physiologic standpoint, because indeed the brain cells start to disintegrate, start to burst. There's no way those brain cells are forming memories. If you look at the studies that were done trying to replicate the hallucinatory effect of a near-death experience, there are similarities when the neurotransmitters are injected, but the memory, again, is qualitatively different. It is not a near-death experience. I mean, these are not recollections. I remember the day my son was killed very clearly, But I know that if I were to tell that experience of that day every couple of years for the rest of my life, the details would change a little bit. But
Kevin?
everyone's description of a near-death experience remains exactly the same, no matter how much time has passed.
I think the memories are extremely vivid. And the reason that they're vividly recalled is because you are activating your memory system because of fight or flight. And one of the best examples, if you ever want to read, is of Dostoevsky when he went through a mock execution. He was in no danger of cardiac arrest or fainting like some of his other fellow prisoners were. But his memory for the experience, which he wrote about later, is extremely much.
The problem
like
with that is in those 500 stories, have only talked to a handful of people who chose to return. And they chose to return for very specific reasons. I have not spoken to a single person who has had a near-death experience who voluntarily said, yeah, I want to come back. And so that speaks against the idea that it's this fight or flight, that it's some evolutionarily beneficial process, because nobody wants to come back.
Well, no, I don't think that's true. I have a number of people who want to come back. In fact, one of the people I can think of, she is married, she had a child. The child was about 6 months old, and there was a lot of ironing to be done. And she got all the ironing in a basket, and she had her cardiac arrest, and she had her near-death experience, and she went down the tunnel, met the being of light. And then there was a discussion with her father, who had already died, and she said, I've got to go back because my husband can't do the ironing. I have to go back. And that was the reason that she said. In fact, some of them do have reasons for why they come back.
I think it's important, though, I think, just to touch on what Mary says. And I think, Mary, that's why I strongly look into calling people's experiences such as yours no longer near-death experience. Because as you probably agree, medically, there is no such thing as being near-death. It's a very unscientific term. My way that I would define yours is an actual death experience. And therefore, what I think is often what Kevin may be talking about is actually a different experience. Basically, if you think about it, many human experiences have a lot of overlap. It doesn't mean they're the same thing. So I think it's important that going forward, we study people who've objectively gone through a period of cardiac arrest because, one, we understand the physiology. It's clear, we can study it, we can measure it, and then we can go back and look at human experience. And certainly the evidence that's coming through at least raises a serious question, which is that, as you were coming to, can human mind and consciousness, even though we've all perceived that it's produced by brain activity, well, the evidence is that at least is being challenged because we have cases where brain activity cannot be going on, but consciousness and memory appears to be going on. So maybe, for instance, human memory, we should be thinking about the relationship between memory, consciousness, and the brain, perhaps more as like the RAM in a computer. So is the memory coming because of RAM? In other words, you need it for memory to express itself? Or is it that the memory is being formed by the hard drive? So how does it work? And these are all interesting questions that are coming out for us. But I think at least those of us who are actively involved in the field of cardiac arrest, who also work with so-called near-death or what I call actual death experiences, we consider that there's enough to make us want to pursue this question more, that consciousness may continue when the brain is not functioning, when we've gone beyond the threshold of death.
I want to go to the audience. I'm guessing that there might be a few questions or comments here. Before I do that, I just have one final question for Kevin. What would it take for you to accept the idea that consciousness can be separated from brain function? What would be the study that would prove that for you?
Well, the answer to that is very long, but let me give the general principle of it. I'm going to rely on the words of the astronomer Carl Sagan. That is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that's a high bar, and we need a high bar.
Can you be more specific than that? What would be? Is there an experiment that could be done that would prove this?
Science deals with the objectively verifiable. Now, these are subjective experiences, and so they by themselves are difficult to objectively verify. So it's going to require a study that will objectively verify this individual's experience, and it will mean that they are, in fact, clearly their brain is not functioning.
Could such a study be done?
Yes, it can be done.
Okay.
We
There
all
are roving
agree.
mics here. Please raise your hands, and we will. Here, let's go to the gentleman right over here.
No. I spent many months trying to come up with an alternative explanation. But no, the water wasn't cold, I wasn't young. We were in the middle of a very inaccessible river in the middle of southern Chile. I did not have Sam's expertise. We had
You
nothing.
did well without it.
99.
So no, there really is no, at the end of spending many months collecting data, my conclusion was that my experience absolutely was outside the boundaries of science and outside the boundaries of medicine. There were no explanations I could find.
I can give you one answer to this. One of the things I've been doing is studying death. In fact, what is the process of death? How do we die? And so we've got two things here. We've got the near-death experience with the going down the tunnel being of light, the special area that you go into. And so that and only in cardiac arrest, only do it in cardiac arrest. So that tells us then that there is something very special going on for whatever reasons during the time the heart stops. So we need to look for other outliers when consciousness is in some way disintegrating. And in fact, the time to do this is to look at death itself. And if you look at death itself, one of the things you find that as you come closer and closer and closer towards death, a whole lot of the phenomena that you see in the near-death experience start occurring to the people who are dying. For example, they see dead relatives who come into the room. As they go on to the next stage, they exist in two realities. They exist in the reality which is full of light and love and spiritual beings and dead relatives. Then they're back in the hospice. Then they go back to the other reality again. Then they're back in the hospice. And so as the whole consciousness fragments, what seems to come through in the dying is this other reality.
But
I think
Peter,
that's a
if
sort of cross-validation.
But if I can interject, I mean, the question was, can science
Yes,
get
it
a
can.
handle on this? I mean,
Absolutely.
can you go beyond the subjective, however extraordinary, the subjective stories? I mean, can using the tools that we have at the disposal of science right now, can they verify this?
Well, I'm sure that one of the things we could do is to start putting people who are dying in scanners so that we can actually see what their brains are doing. But I'm not sure that this would pass many ethics committees.
So, Sam, you were saying that science can definitively test this.
I think the ladies asked a very interesting question, and I think that the point we have to remember is that at any given era, scientists will set sort of boundaries for what knowledge that is known at that time. And things work within that boundaries, but always there are things that don't quite fit in there. And many times, most scientists will ignore that. They'll try to stick to the framework that they have because it's more comfortable. And they'll continue researching that area. And then sometimes you have to go and look beyond. So what we have right now is certain phenomena that are challenging our worldview, and we have to be able to explore them. So I think to be able to explore this, the question essentially that I think you're asking is, can we test somehow scientifically the idea that consciousness, and by consciousness I want to be clear, what we're talking about is what the Greeks called the psyche or the soul, that thing that makes us who we are. It's just a scientific term for me, for the self. Can we test whether that can be separate from brain function?
Right.
And so I think one area to do this is looking at times where, whether we like it or not, the brain has to be shut down. One of those is when the heart stops and there's inadequate blood getting into the brain. So we could continue the sorts of studies we've started with the AWARE study. But another area, which is perhaps more controlled, is looking at certain groups of patients who have to go for surgery where their only option is to have their body cool down to such an extent, basically to 18 degrees Celsius, which is around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, that their brain also flatlines. The brain cannot function. There's no circulation at all. And to study whether consciousness continues or stops. So if when the brain doesn't function, consciousness also completely stops and there is no element of that, then that suggests that consciousness must be produced from the brain. If on the other hand you can get reports of people who can accurately have awareness, they can see things or hear things, and we can validate those claims, then clearly that suggests that consciousness may be functioning independent of the brain, and that in that case, perhaps the brain is acting more as a mediator rather than the producer of consciousness.
But how do you know that?
You can set targets for them.
No, but many of the stories might be that people talk about might be as they are coming out of this unconscious state, and maybe the doctors assume that they were unconscious.
That's a very good point. So you're basically saying is, do we know if the experience is occurring when the brain's coming back online or just before they're flatlined? Well, actually, one of the things that we did find in our AWARE study is that this is the first documented case of somebody who we can verify that they had consciousness at least during a 3 to 5 minute period when the brain would not have been functioning, rather than, so we've timed it, rather than when the brain was coming back online. But you can do that because you can give patients, say, who are having surgery and whose brain has shut down, certain stimuli at certain times. And then if they can recall them, you know that it was occurring when the brain had flatlined. You also can give them stimuli when the brain has come back online. So you can distinguish when the consciousness or activity of the mind or psyche or soul or whatever term you want to use it is going on.
Okay. Before we go to the next question, Kevin, do you want to respond?
Yeah, let's take a little different tack. First thing what you cannot do is reproduce much of the context of near-death experience. That is the fear of dying. And that takes away a great deal. But that doesn't mean we cannot have human models for near-death experience. In fact, we already do. In 1994, a neurologist in Germany by the name of Lempert had 42 people experience syncope. They were young college students. And he recorded their subjective experiences. And when he compared those to Raymond Moody's reports, there are in fact no differences. That includes the tunnel, seeing other beings, having out-of-body experiences. So in fact, we already have a model for near-death experience, but again, we can't put it in the context of fear of your dying. And the context is important. You can't underestimate the context in which these experiences are occurring.
I think the answer to that is at the level that we have to have it, we don't have it yet. There is a lot of data which is suggestive, but it's not absolutely certain, usually because it's people going back through the medical notes and people's memories of what happened. Now, what is interesting is that for me, the near-death experience is one of our ways, or one of the roads by which we can understand consciousness. So therefore, it should tell us something about human consciousness, and it should be central, and it's very important. Can we get funding for it? No. So this means that one of the most important sets of experiences that we need to do, we can't actually do. In fact, Sam and I put in a grant to one of the European institutions, and the idea was to put cards on the ceiling so that the people, when they had their cardiac arrest, could see the cards and report. And they came back and they said, brilliantly designed study, you can do it, no cards on the ceiling. Now that, of course, really altered exactly what we wanted to do. So if there is more money about, then we can do it properly. And so that's really what we have to do. But I think things are changing a little bit.
No, in general, I agree with Peter on this. One of the sad things is that despite the great general interest, despite the media interest in this topic, there's no funding institution interest. People don't die of near-death experiences, so there's not. So it's hard. I submitted an NIH grant, and I could tell from the reviewers' comments that they didn't even know what study section to put this grant in. And the same with private foundations as well. It's really unfortunate because there's a lot more science and work that really could be done.
The other problem, though, is I think it's very difficult just even in collecting those stories because, first of all, in my experience, most people do not want to talk about it. With increased awareness of near-death experiences, more and more people are beginning to feel comfortable mentioning it. But the vast majority of people, if they mention it at all, they mention it to their spouse or their parent or someone, and they're immediately shut down and they never talk about it again until they share that experience with me or someone else who would understand them. And so I think the first problem is actually having people tell you their story. The second problem, even with the idea of putting the cards, which on the surface sounds like a brilliant idea, I will tell you that from my personal experience, I probably would have come back and not been able to discuss the cards because
I think that's
it
old
was
technology
wholly
now.
unimportant. I
Things have moved
would
on
never
from there.
have even thought twice about taking those notes, partly because I had no intention of coming back. And so I think it's very difficult to design a study like that that would prove this out-of-body consciousness.
Yeah, actually, I mean, people can have out-of-body experiences if they want. I mean, first of all, you can make yourself faint. You know, it's the old party trick: squat down, hyperventilate, stand up quickly, and Valsalva. In fact, that's one of the things that kind of got me interested. And I did that as a youth and had an ESP experience. I thought, wow, that's strange. So it sort of got me going. The other is that you can develop a technique called lucid dreaming. And in REM sleep, you turn off the dorsolateral prefrontal area of your brain, and that's where most of our executive function takes place. And if you don't turn that off, then we can have lucid dreaming, where you have insight that you are actually in a dream. Normally, we lose that insight as part of the usual aspect of sleep, but you can train yourself to have lucid dreams, and during lucid dreams are often out-of-body experiences because you're simultaneously turning off the temporal parietal area.
Time for
Can I just quick answers to that? Thank you very much for that comment. And the way that you introduced it, I think, was absolutely correct. Rather than looking at these things entirely through the perspective of near-death experiences, perhaps we can look at other methods which can change consciousness. Well, of course, what you've got is the near-death suggesting a model. And if we can model this in other different ways so that we can get the same phenomena, then it'd be an excellent thing to do. But I can also suggest to you that you probably won't get much funding for that at the moment either. Kevin's lucid dreaming, I've done a lot of work on lucid dreaming. And in fact, one of the first papers I published was on lucid dreamers. And I just don't find his phenomena. The sorts of things that Kevin talks about certainly weren't in my group of lucid dreamers. We were doing simple experiments, like, for example, if you held up a finger, is it a real finger or not a real finger in the dream? Well, in fact, in lucid dreams, you can actually check that. So what you can do it with your friends when you go out, is lift up your finger and then hold your head steady and scan it with your eyes. And you'll see, those of you who are close enough, is that my eyes following it. Now I'm going to hold up an imaginary finger and try and scan it, and I can't do it. It makes jumps. Now, do lucid dreamers, because they can move their eyes in their dream.
It's because you're using saccades and smooth pursuit, using two different ocular
systems. That's absolutely right. And the point is that the lucid dreamers use the whole Monty and not the imaginary one. So lucid dreaming is a quite different state, but it doesn't produce what Kevin said. Yes, that came from me, and that came also because I had to look at a PhD thesis, and the basis of the PhD thesis was what happens if we take the veridical near-death out-of-body experiences as in fact being a correct reflection of reality. Now, of course, as soon as you get into quantum mechanics, then the whole pattern changes enormously, and the whole idea of us being separate is something that quantum mechanics doesn't recognize. We're all connected. And so I think that the ideas of near-death experience and the relationship to physical theories of mind is very important.
We could go on, but we are out of time. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, our panelists. It has been very wonderful.